Hi guys, welcome back to my UE4 tutorial series. In this one I thought I'd put together a little two-parter on force fields. So there's loads of audio opportunities to cover in this, as well as other subjects like collision and health and damage. And also we're going to be setting up some sound mix modifiers and sound classes for when you're inside the bubble shield. So you can see it here. I'll just give you a quick play test so you can see what we're going to be building. Okay, so you can see the bullet impacts working there. We go inside, we set a sound mix modifier, we play our on-off sound, and we turn off our looping cue as well. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so I recognise that some of you might not have access to that mesh that's inside the bubble shield there, so it doesn't really matter, it's just a focal point for our button really, so we can use a shape from the content browser for that. So let's use a capsule shape and let's build the blueprint around that by creating a blueprint using this actor. And it wants to save in our blueprints folder, which is fine. I'm just going to rename it bubble shield. Okay, so we're in our blueprint now, so let's build the components that we need to create this bubble shield. So first off, let's create a sphere mesh. This is what's going to hold our material for the outside of the bubble shield. So let's call this bubble shield. And let's bump up the size to about 6. Okay, cool. So the reason why you can't see it now is because it's opaque, so we need to apply our material. I made a material earlier just using bits and pieces that were hanging around in the content browser. Yeah, so I'll give you a quick look at that before we move forward. Maybe you can make your own. Yeah, you can learn a ton of stuff just by digging around in the material editor. But yeah, just go into their materials, pull them apart, see how they work, and you can learn a ton of stuff. So yeah, there's not too much going on in here. It's just a panning texture and some distortion in the normal, which makes it look like a bubble, like shimmering. Yeah, if you are going to make one, just remember to plug something into the opacity so you can see through it, so it's transparent, and just make sure that it's enabled as transparent on the material. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is I want to create a capsule collision component. This is going to be the collision for our button. So I'm just going to bump up the size slightly so we can get the player inside it. Yeah, something like that will do. Okay, so that's done. Let's now set up an audio component. This is going to hold our looping cue for the power. So we'll call that bubble shield power cue, and I'm just going to go and select that from the content browser, and I made this earlier in Pro Tools. There it is. Okay, cool. Yeah, that's working. And then just for fun, let's create a text render component. Just type text up here. This is really just a nice visual cue to see if we're inside that collision radius for our power button. So I'm just going to lift up this text render component and I'm going to rename it bubble shield power on off. Okay, cool. I'm just going to give that a quick compile. Just rename this to power button collision. Okay, so the next thing I want to make is another sphere collision component, but this time it's going to sit around the bubble shield itself. So I'm not going to use the collision on the mesh right away. So it's just a little bit more performant using a collision component rather than the mesh itself. So that's a little bit small. The idea is we get it around the bubble shield, so I'm just going to bump it up to about 10. That's a bit too big maybe. Let's drop it down to 9, see what happens. Okay, that's inside the bubble shield now, so let's just leave it at 10. Okay. Okay, so now we've built the components for a bubble shield, let's go into the event graph and do stuff with them. So the first thing we want to do is create a couple of variables. One which says power button reached, and the other which says force field or bubble shield activated. We're going to make them discoverable so we can find them in the level blueprint later, because that's where we're going to be pushing our E key and our button. Okay, so I've just spotted something. I'm going to rename this sphere collision to bubble shield collision. And there's another thing we need to do just to debug this. Is you also need to go onto the mesh and turn the collision off for now. We're going to need to use this later for the bullet impacts, but just while we're debugging it, I'm going to switch that to no collision. And compile and save. Okay, so let's go and grab our power collision component that we created earlier. So what we want to do is we want to set up a couple of overlap events for when the player crosses the boundary of the collision capsule. So we can do that by scrolling down here and selecting on component begin overlap. And we'll get another one for the end of overlaps when we leave the collision radius. Okay, so next then I want to set this by holding the Alt key and dragging. And I'm going to set this to true if the player is inside the collision radius, and do another one for when he leaves, but I'm going to set that to false. Now you could just use the default buttons actually on these variables here, but I'm going to use something slightly different to check whether the player is inside. So I'll just go to my hero character, and I don't know if you know this, but you can scroll down and add a tag to any actor. So I've called this friendly by adding a tag right down the bottom here in the class defaults. So what I can do now is I can check to see if the player has entered the collision radius by going actor has tag and then hooking that up there. But I also need to actually type in the tag that I put on the player character as well. So just make sure you spell that correctly as friendly. And we'll do another one for down here. Okay, cool. So now we want to create a branch. So the shortcut for that is hold the B key down and click, and just hook these up. And I'll get that variable again and just plug that into the condition there. Okay, so now let's create a toggle visibility node for our text render component that we created earlier. And what this is going to do is it's going to show and hide the text render component when we enter and leave the collision radius. Okay, so there's something that I need to mention here as well, is that at the moment both of these sets will be true because the player has entered or left it. So we need to employ a not boolean, which is just going to flip that set to a false, and that's going to be able to work, hopefully. So let's save it and compile it and give it a test. Just sort these windows out. Okay, so we go inside, and it disappears. So that's the wrong way around, so that's not quite what we want. But there's an easy way to fix that. I've just forgotten to do something. So let's just go and fix that. So if you just come over to the blueprint and then go and select the text render component, its default is visible. So we want that to be invisible right off the bat when the level's loaded. So we'll just save and compile and we'll go in, and it should be flipped around now. So when we walk in, boom, there we go. And when we leave, it turns off. Okay, cool, so that's working. So now let's set up a couple of event dispatchers by coming down to the event dispatchers section at the bottom here and just typing button true and another one for button false. Okay, so we're going to use these event dispatchers to communicate with our level blueprint, and we can call that event dispatcher here. So that's essentially going to fire off that message for us when we enter the collision component, and another one for false here. Okay, so what these event dispatchers are going to allow us to do is to communicate between our bubble shield blueprint and our level blueprint. So that's going to be important later for when we want to put a key input for the player to turn the power on and off. So sometimes it's a little bit difficult to show up, so you need to save it and compile it. Okay, so let's go into our level blueprint and see if we can find these event dispatchers. So if I type button false or just button true, okay, it's not showing up. Okay, so if that happens to you, just go in and save everything and give it a quick build and it should show up. Okay, yeah, so now it's showing up in the defaults tab. Just as a point of reference, you can also The reason why it's showing up in the defaults tab is if I go back into the blueprint, that's because these event dispatchers are set up to in the default menu there, and that also translates to the level blueprint lists here as well, so it's just something to watch out for. Okay, so I'm going to need one of these. Let's get the true one first, and let's get the false. Now let's right click and create the key input. So if I type E input and then press enter, so when the player presses E, we're going to be able to turn the power on and off. So the next thing I want to do is open a gate. So remember those messages from earlier, if we enter the collision radius, it will open the gate, and when we leave, I want to close the gate. And when I press the E key, I want to enter the gate. Okay, cool. So we now set up our conditions for our gate. Based off that collision radius, we can set up a branch. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is I want to get that variable that I created earlier, bubble shield, activated. So I'm going to create a reference to the bubble shield, and then it'll give me access to the ball variable. I'm going to route that through. Okay, cool. So now we can do stuff. So let's create a deactivate branch with a load of different conditions, and an activate branch based off this true or false. So the first thing I want to do is I want to set that variable again to be deactivated. So we'll leave that as false, and then come down the bottom here and set that to activated. So straight off the bat, we're setting the conditions of the bubble shield. Okay, so let's start by copying and pasting that reference to the bubble shield there, and this time I want to get the mesh, and I'm going to toggle the visibility of the mesh, or set the visibility of this mesh. So let's go set visibility. Yep. Okay, so I'm going to route that through, and I'm going to leave that as off, so it's invisible. And on this one, I'm going to do the same, but I'm going to make it visible. Okay, so actually, first off, let's just create a comment here and color these so it's just really clear for you guys what's happening. So this is going to be the disabled branch, and this is going to be the activated branch. So we do green for this one. Okay, cool. So this is where all our code's going to live. I'll just rename this to activate, and this one to deactivate. And I'll just stretch these out as well, just give us plenty of room. Okay, cool. Okay. Right, so let's get another reference to one of them components in the bubble shield again. Let's get the collision, get the bubble collision. And let's drag that out, and then let's set collision enabled. So you can sort of see what we're doing here. We're turning the visibility off, and we're turning the collision on and off for the bubble shield as well, so we're able to walk through it, and also it's not going to be able to impact any of the projectiles later. Okay, so let's get another reference from that bubble shield, and let's this time get the cue, so that we'll turn our sound on and off this time. So I want to drag this off and go stop. Oh no, that's the wrong one. It needs to be the audio one, so audio stop. Okay, yep, that's the one. And then plug that into the component. And I'm going to do the reverse for this one, so it's going to be audio play. So yeah, we could fade this in and out and make the transition a little bit smoother in between, but I'm just going to do it just a simple play and stop for now. Okay, what have I done here? Okay, yeah, I've not plugged in the reference for those ball variables when I was setting them earlier, so I'll just compile that. Okay, cool. So yeah, let's give that a little play test. Let's save it all. Okay, cool. So we go inside, and our text comes on, and when we hit the E key, Okay. So when I hit the E key, it's firing off those event dispatchers, and that shouldn't be happening. And now the gate's closed, and now I can't open it again. So that's a bit weird. I think there's something wrong with the collision component that we created earlier. We need to go into the collision settings and set something up. So yeah, that's not enabling the gate to come back on and off unless we go out of it and then come back in again. Okay, cool. So let's go back into the bubble shield then and go over to our bubble shield power button collision. And yeah, that's creating overlap events for when I actually press the key, which I don't want to happen. So I'm just going to go in here and turn that to ignore on world dynamic. And then hopefully that will work. Okay, so let's give it another test. Okay, press the E key. It's not open, and then okay, yeah, it seems to be working. Okay, so it's not firing those event dispatchers now when I press the E key, which is what I want. It's only when the body goes inside the radius that I want that to fire off an event dispatcher. Okay, cool. So let's play a sound at location. I'm going to get the bubble shield blueprints location for this. So I'm going to drag off a reference and get the location. This is going to give me a vector that I can plug into the location. And then I'm going to scroll down and select the force field power deactivate queue. Okay, so let's see how this works. Yep. Okay, and then let's copy this, paste it down here, and route that through. And this time I'm going to use the activate one that I made. Cool. Okay, so what to do next? Let's create a sound mix modifier, push and pop. I'm going to do this in the next tutorial, so we'll just plug in the nodes for each of these. So pop is off, like popping a button, and push is on for the sound mix modifier. So we'll just set those up there for now. We'll do something with them in the next tutorial. Okay, it might be fun to make a timeline and change the size of the bubble shield. That might be fun. Okay, so let's create a timeline and just disconnect that so it always plays from the start. And a scale. Oh, hang on, we need to get a reference to the bubble shield before we can get the scale. Yeah, so let's get a reference to the bubble shield and copy and paste and drag it over. And we want to change the mesh for this. So if we get that component that we created earlier for the mesh, and then let's drag that off and then set scale. Yep, set world scale 3D is the one we want. Okay, and then we want to plug the update from the timeline in there. So now when we go into the timeline, we can create a vector track because we're working with vectors and the scale of the actor. So I'm just going to call this actor scale. And I'm going to whiz the video on a little bit here, but basically what I'm doing is right-clicking to create points on this graph. And I'm going to set the scale. So the scale to start with, let's just check that first. So let's go back to the bubble shield. I think I set it to 6. Hang on. The actual mesh. Yeah, it was 6. Cool. So this is the size when it's activated and it's being deactivated. So this needs to be 6. And time is 0. And I'm going to need to do this for each of these points. So let's just whiz the video on. And then ending at 0 size. So it's going to shrink it right down when we deactivate it. Okay, so I'm going to copy that timeline because I've just done all that work. And I'm going to copy this set actor scale and route this into the play reverse from end, because we want to go backwards, and plug that in there and plug that in there. Okay, so let's just set that up, give it a quick play test. I'll just move these screens around. The power's on, but there's a problem. We're setting the visibility first, so we don't actually see it shrink down. And also I've forgotten to do something. I've forgotten to route in the scale track to our set actor 3D scale. So we'll just move this visibility first, and we'll shuffle this away and put it at the end, so after the timeline. And I'm going to take that from finish rather than update, otherwise that's not going to work properly. And yeah, I forgot to route through that. So if we compile it and save it now. Oh, there's one more thing I need to do. I'm always doing this. Okay. And then save all. I'll just shuffle that over for you. Okay. So now we should see it shrink down. And then blow up. Okay, cool. That kind of wraps up this tutorial. It's getting quite long, so we'll leave it here. In the next one, we'll set up damage for the bubble shield. We'll also set up some more plasma bullet impacts for the bubble shield itself. And we'll also set those sound mix modifiers up as well and bring the AI in so we can test what the sound's doing when we're inside the bubble shield. So, okay, cool. If you liked it, hit the like button and stay subscribed for future tutorials, and I'll catch you next time.